from 9 a.m. through until about 1 o'clock or 1:30. I'll be speaking at the beginning, Rabbi Wein will be speaking at the end, Rabbi Manning will be here, Rabbi Glasser will be here. We also have the parents of Maoz Morale, who was unfortunately killed, fell as a soldier fighting in this war. So it's a very, very interesting and inspiring day. So please join us on Wednesday. In terms of this, Tzurba Marabanan shir, today will be our last shir on Hilchot Shabbat before Chanukah, because there will be a shir next week, but we will be discussing Hilchot Chanukah. It's that time of year, so we'll be taking a break from Hilchot Shabbat. On Chanukah itself, I'm not sure if there will be a shir. Stay tuned for the announcements, and then following that, we'll return to Hilchot Shabbat, Chazara. Okay, so here we are. We are continuing volume 18 of the Tzurba Rabbanan series. We are discussing the laws of Bishul D'Rabbanan at this point. We're talking about, we've learned so far how to keep our food hot before Shabbat. We learned last week that if we have the hot food on the hot plate or the blech or the fire, whatever it is, and we wanted to take it off and put it back to keep it hot, we learned how to do that last week. So I refer you to the recording of the shir if you weren't here. And today we'll learn about something new, which is related to Chazara, but it's really what we call Hanacha Lekatchila or Netina Lekatchila. In other words, what we learned last week was that if I have food that is on the hot plate or the blech, and I take it off and I want to put it back on, there are a number of conditions. I can't put it down on the floor. It needs to still be in my hand. It needs to still be hot, etc. We discussed last week. What if one or more of those conditions was absent? Okay, and now I want to put it back. Or alternatively, I have food which was not on the hot plate at the beginning of Shabbat. Okay, we're not talking about Friday night. Maybe we're talking about Shabbat lunch. We've got my schnitzels, got my kugel that's been in the fridge overnight, and I want to heat it up in the morning because I don't want to eat. It's winter now, it's cold. I don't want to eat cold cuts and potato salad for lunch. I want to have warm schnitzels. I want to have hot kugel, etc. Is there a way? What we learned last week is that if you have continuously considered to be on the fire. In other words, I take the food off the fire, but I don't put it down. I have the intent to put it back, so I'm not disconnecting that original placement on the fire, and therefore I'm allowed to return it. Here I'm not returning it. Here I'm putting it on in the first place, right? I'm not going to keep my schnitzels on the hot plate overnight because in the morning there will be no schnitzels left. I think I told you the story once of a friend of mine. The first Shabbat that they got married, he did not know Hilchot Shehiyah and Chazara, etc. And they thought that there was no way to put food on the fire on Shabbat, so they thought they'll leave everything on the fire on Friday night, and the house nearly burnt down. Thankfully, it didn't. But they had an interesting situation there. But is there a way? And how is there a way for us to take food in the morning of Shabbat, food that was not on the hot plate like Katchila, and heat it up? Okay, that's our discussion for today, and that's not, as I say, not Chazara, but that is Netina Lekatchila. So again, just to put things in order, put things in perspective, we have our flow chart in our head of how we heat up food on Shabbat. Remember, question number one is always going to be, is this bishul d'oraita? Is the food cooked or not? Right? If the food is not cooked, so there's nothing to talk about. That's bishul d'oraita. So we're dealing with fully cooked food. It's the schnitzel, the kugel, whatever you want. Okay, you can tell what I like to have for Shabbos lunch. But that's condition number one. Okay, once we've gotten around that, so remember we have two major concerns. One concern that Chazal had is that perhaps we will come to stoke the coals, or we'll come to raise the heat of the heat source when I have the food on, and therefore I have to make sure that the flame is covered, right? That is one condition. But beyond that, we still have the concern of michzikim vashal, that it looks like cooking. So if this is the normal way that somebody cooks, then we have a problem. Okay, so that's what we're going to deal with. How do we circumvent all of that? So let us start. Let's begin. Let's go to page 184 in the book. Right, you'll see the heading there. It says Hanacha Lechatchila, the principle of Hanacha Lechatchila. Right, and I'll just say this before we begin. We have a Gemara which is in Masechet Shabbat, and it's brought in the Shulchan Aruch as well, which says the following. We've discussed this previously. It's not in your books, but the Gemara says as follows: if you were to take food again, and you were to place it near the fire, you don't place food on the fire, but you place it near the fire. In other words, to take off the chill, to warm it up a little bit. It's not going to get discussion there, which we've discussed in the past, whether it's going to get to Yad Soleil Bor, it can't get to Yad Soleil Bor, you'll take it off before it gets to Yad Soleil Bor, whatever it is. But if you place the food near the fire, the Gemara says that is mutar. Shulchan Aruch says that is okay. Why? Let's think about it. Either the food is fully cooked, or it's not going to reach the temperature of cooking, so that's not a concern. I'm not going to stoke the coals because I'm not actually putting it on the fire, right? And it doesn't look like cooking because I'm not putting it on the fire. When you want to cook food, you put it on the fire. Put food next to the fire, or if you put food on the radiator, for example, okay, that's not the way that people cook, generally speaking. And therefore, if I was to take, we have a whole discussion in the Shulchan Aruch about the tanur shachorov, right, which is essentially a radiator. If a person wants to place their food on the radiator to heat it up, so that would be, there would be no issue with that. That does not look like cooking. Again, food is fully cooked, etc. Now, based on that, we actually have a contradiction in terms of the Shulchan Aruch. We have two simanim, or two seifim in the same siman, where the Shulchan Aruch seems to rule in an opposite manner, and how we resolve this contradiction is going to determine how we are going to be able to heat up our food on Shabbat, what we're required to do with the blech, with the hot plate, etc. So let's have a look at it. Source number 30. So we begin source number 30 in the Beit Yosef. He says, and he quotes here one of the Rishonim, which is the Mordechai. So it says, Katuv Agad Mordechai as follows. Hamashkim baboker va'ashek tichat tavshilo. We've quoted this in the past in a slightly different context. But he says like this: somebody wakes up in the morning and you see that your food is getting burned, the cholent or whatever it is, it's on the fire and it's starting to get burnt. Okay, you're worried that it's going to get burnt further. We'll talk later on. I think somebody asked a question before: would there be a permissible way to add water into the cholent? That's a separate question. It's a question of bishul. We'll get to that as well. But right now, so he says the following: he says you want to take the food off the flame, but maybe you want to put it on a lower flame, or you want to keep it to be warmed up, but you don't want it to burn. So he says like this, says the Mordechai, Omerani, she'achol lahasir ulaniach dera lekanit al pi hakila. He says you can take it off, take an empty pot now and place that on top of your stove. And that is the equivalent of covering up the fire. Remember, what are our condition, both in many cases in terms of shehiyah and in terms of chazara, was that the fire has to be what we call grufa uktuma. The fire has to be covered up so you won't come to stoke the flames. So he says if you place an empty pot on top, that is considered like covering up the fire. That is grufa uktuma. Shekdira sotemet et piakirat, closes up the opening of the stove. And then you can put the pot back on top of the empty pot. Okay, now notice what he's dealing with here. This is not yet our question of our scenario of hanacha lechatchila. This is still chazara. We're dealing with a pot that was on the fire. There's a way to take it off and put it back on. So all our conditions here are fulfilled. But what he's telling us is that if you take this empty pot and you place it on top of the stove, that empty pot is equivalent to covering up the fire, making it grufa.
Take out the pot that's burning. You have to keep your hand on it when you put.
Seemingly, according to this, yes. Yeah. Now, I just want to go back. There was a picture in here somewhere. Just helps to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Go back to page 170 for a moment, right? And this is the picture. This is the kira in there. Actually, maybe even on page 171, might illustrate it better. Right, this is the kira in their day. So you can see underneath, you've got the fire, you've got all the coals, and you have these holes on top where the pot goes. So essentially what he's saying is, fill up the hole with the pot, okay? Meaning, right now I can't do anything with the fire underneath, but if I fill up the hole with the pot on top, and now I place my pot on top of that empty pot, it's not directly on the fire, it's as if the fire is covered up. Okay, that's essentially what the model is saying. It's like a blech, exactly. Okay, now, so that is the Mordechai, and that is source number 30. We're back on page 185. If you have a look now at the Rashba, who's another one of the Rishonim, the Rashba writes something a little bit different. He says, Mutar latet agabek dera b'Shabbat, tavshil shenit bashel me'erev Shabbat kol tzorko. He says, I can place a cooked food. He says, latet agabek dera Shabbat, I can place on top of the pot, basically another food that was fully cooked. Kagon panadish This is some sort of a meat pastry. All the discussion of Echot Shabbat, this is apparently what the Rishonim used to eat. They had this cooked pastry with meat inside. That was what we have many discussions related to the panadish or the infanda or whatever it's called. Huh? It's an empanada. Empanada. Okay, there you go. Shalom will be giving culinary classes after the show. So Chazoin Kedei Lechamaman, ואפילו תהיה צולדת בו, ואף על פי שהקטרה נתונה על גבי האש, לפי שאין דרך בישול בכך. So he says, essentially, I have my pot that's on the fire. Here he's not talking about chazara. Here he's talking about placing something new. But what he's saying is, I have my pot of food, cholent, whatever it is, which is cooking on the fire. I now have another food, what did you call it?
Empanada.
Empanada, okay, which I place on top of the pot. I'm not placing it on the fire. I'm placing it on top of the pot. He says, that I can do like a tchila. He says, that's right, because nobody cooks like that. How do you cook? You put your pot on the fire. You don't put a pot on top of a pot. That's not cooking. That's not mixing with Bashan.
The food has to be fully cooked.
The food has correct. The food has to be fully cooked, because if the food is not fully cooked in the first place, I can never put it on the fire on Shabbat. That's Isur D'Oraita. But we have an Isur D'Rabanan of Michzik in Bashan, that if I take a fully cooked food and I place it on the fire, it looks like I'm cooking. And Chazal said, don't do that, because you'll come to cook. Okay, you think you won't, you will, right? So you have to make it that it won't look like it. So that's what he says here, and he says that is similar to what the Gemara says, where I place food next to the fire or opposite the fire. Okay, but notice that these are two different cases. The case of Dagot Mordechai, where he was talking about an empty pot as well, but there was where the food was already. He didn't say I can take food out of the fridge. No, fridges in those days, but he didn't say I can take food and I can that's not hot and I can place it on top. Saying food that's already on the fire, I can move it in such a way if I put this pot on. Yeah, the Rashba is telling me no, you can take a food that's completely cold, but it's cooked, and I can place it on top of a pot and to cook it lekatchila on Shabbat. Okay, not to cook it, to warm it. So the Shulchan Aruch, you'll notice, actually paskins like both of these, and it's a bit of a contradiction. Shulchan Aruch in source number 32, notice 32 and 33, these are just two seifim apart. Okay? In the same siman in Reish Nun Gimel, he says like this, Hamashkim, and he quotes almost verbatim the language of the Rishonim. Hamashkim ba'boker v'ra'ashek dichat avshilo. You wake up in the morning, you see your food is burning. Ve'arei pen yakdiach yoter. You're worried it will burn some more. So yachol lasir o laniach k'derei she'ena rekanit al pi akira. Says you take an empty pot and you place it on top of the stove. And then take your food, which is cooking, which is burning. It's cooked, but it's burning, right? And you place that on top of the empty pot. That's the answer to your question. You should be careful in the meantime. Don't place it on the floor, etc. It still has to be hot. Now, two seifim later, what does he say? He says, "Mutar latet al pik derat chamin b'Shabbat." I have my chamin, I have my cholent, but it can be any cooked food that's on the fire. I can place on top of that tafshil shenit bashel me'erev Shabbat kol tzoko. I can place on top of that my cooked food. Again, it was cooked before Shabbat. Kagon panadish, or as we call it, empanada. V'chayot sebahen lechamaman. In order to heat it up, lefi she'ein derech bishul bakach, because that is not the normal manner of cooking. Okay, again, is the contradiction clear? The question is, what we're saying in both of these cases is I take my food and I place it on top of another pot on the fire. But in Seif Gimel, he says you can only do that if the food's already on the fire, meaning this is a form of chazara, you're just moving it up a level. But in Seif A, he says, you could do that lekatchila. You could take your food out, your schnitzel out of the fridge. So if we ask...
I said before show that you can't. He just talked about a different case. No. Yeah, I don't either.
All the Achronim see it as a contradiction. Why don't you... No, but we'll see in a moment. It's important. But you're saying he's just talking about two different cases.
No, there's no stira, I don't think, of immediately here that you can't have both of those at the same time. They're different cases, and this is fine.
So why do we have to mention both cases? I mean, what's the difference between the two cases?
Well, maybe because he's just bringing both of them and he's putting it in. But okay, then yeah.
Okay, so that could be one thing. You could say, okay, the Shulchan Aruch is just mentioning two cases here. But again, it seems strange that I have two seifim apart. I have two different cases which are very, very similar. Two Rishonim who argue against each other, and the Shulchan Aruch passes both of them. Right. Again, our question right now is the following: I have my schnitzels which are fully cooked, which are in the fridge and are cold. There's no sauce. Okay, we're not going to complicate it like that. But I have my schnitzels which are in the fridge, and I want to heat them up on Shabbat morning.
Right.
According to Seif Gimel, so I have, and what I have right now, let's keep it simple. I have my pot of cholent that's on the fire. Okay, that's been there from before Shabbat. Okay, can I take the schnitzels and place them on top of the pot of cholent? Okay, at this point, we understand that to take them and place them on top of the fire itself, certainly if there's no blech, whatever, that would be forbidden. Even if there is a blech, to place the schnitzels directly on the blech on Shabbos morning, that's a problem of michzikim bashar. I distinguish here between a blech and a hot plate. We'll get to that soon. Okay, but my question is, can I take the schnitzels and place them on top of the pot of cholent? Okay, from the fridge. So according to Seif Hey, source number 33, yes. He says, yes, you can. Right. And according to Seif Gimel, so at worst, he says, no, you can't. And at best, well, he's not talking about that. Okay, but okay. So let's see. But the question is why we have a difference. So see the Mishnah Berurah. So the Mishnah Berurah here says, source number 34, he does not talk about the difference necessarily between the two cases, but he says like this. He says, "Ein derech bishul bakach." Rotzeh lomar. After Kaimalan Shasulite Nekatchila B'Shabbat Al Akira Afilu Nipashal Kotzoko. That's our starting point. You can't Lekatchila just place food on the fire, on the kira, even if it was already cooked. B'Shabbat Afilu Nipashal Kotzoko. Budavar Cham V'Gam Akira Grufa Uktuma. Even when it is cooked and the and the
covered, right.
and the kira is covered. Right. That is because it looks like cooking. Again, you're not transgressing the malacha of bishul. It's something that looks like cooking, so therefore it's an isur d'Rabbanan. Because that's the way that people cook. Aval hacha, where it's on top of a pot of cooked food, ain't derech bishul b'kach. Nobody cooks like that. And everybody they have sek derav and rekem vashal. It does not look like cooking, and therefore it's allowed. Now, have a look here in the commentary in between source number 34 and 35, the second paragraph. So it says, in addition to explaining the second rule, the Chafetz Chaim also addresses the apparent inconsistency in the Shulchan Aruch in the Biur Halacha. Okay, between the two cases, and he's going to quote here the Pri Megadim, who gives one explanation, and again Abraham is going to give a different explanation as to what the difference is between the two cases. Okay, again, you don't want to say it's a contradiction, but the point is we quote two different cases, and why are we quoting two different cases where seemingly you could have said one and it would have been enough? So he says like this, source number 35. It seems to be contradicts or apparently is inconsistent. The okay. מצאתי בפרי מגדים, שישב זו הקושיה בטובתם והוא. דבסעיף ה' שאיילי בעומדת על גבי קדרת חמין או תבשיל, לא נחשב כלל כעומד על גבי קירה, ולכי מותר אף ליתן לכתחילה בשבת. In other words, when I say that I'm placing on top of a pot of cooked food, there's a pot with food that is cooking on the blech or on the fire, whatever it is, and I place the food on top of that, that's not considered I'm putting it on the fire. That's equivalent essentially to placing it on top of the radiator. Nobody cooks that way. Mm-hmm. So placing food on top of a pot of cooked food, right? It's only these meshugana, that would do that because you don't want it to look like cooking. So that's fine. That's mutar l'katrila in terms of anacha. Here he's talking on Seif Gimel, right? Where he talks about the empty pot. He talks about Chazara. He says, Masha'en ken binyanenu. Shakderare kanit. Here the pot is empty. So what if the pot is empty? Right? Ve'omedet rak listom et chom hakira shelo yeh kol כך chom שנעשה את הקירה על ידי זה רק כשאר קירה וגרופה וכתומה ואסור ליתן עליה בשבת תבשיל לכתחילה. In other words, in Seif Gimel here when he talks about putting an empty pot, essentially, what I'm saying is placing that empty pot is equivalent to a blech. It's equivalent to turning it into a blech. So it's not, people can still cook on it. People can still, what I'm doing is I'm lowering the heat. I'm changing it from an uncovered flame to a covered flame. But I'm not completely this is how the Pri Megadim explains. I'm not completely uprooting it from the definition of bishul. In the case where I have the food that's already there, the food of the pot of food that is cooking, and I now place my schnitzels or my infanda on top of the cholent, okay, by placing it on top of a pot of cooked food, that is, I've uprooted the name from cooking. I'm not even putting it on the fire. It's like putting it on the radiator. That doesn't look like cooking at all. In the case where I just put in what the Mordechai was talking about, where he says I put an empty pot, and now I can move the pot that's on the fire into that place so that it won't burn, right? By putting that empty pot, what I've done is the equivalent of what the Gemara calls grifa uktima. In other words, I've now covered the flame. I've now established one of the conditions that I have for returning food or for leaving food, but I've not completely uprooted it. It still has an element of looking like cooking. And therefore there, that's the prima. Yes.
If it's on there and you want it to be warmer than it was on top of the cooked food.
To move it down.
Off the pot and put it back down on the blech or on the top plate.
Okay, so that would be so that would depend. If I now have the pot on a place where it's less, say a place where it's less hot, and now want a place where it's hotter. So that would depend. Number one, is the food is it completely cooked? Meaning, if it's not completely cooked, or even if it's mistamek ve'afelo, then we'd have a question of doing that. Would it essentially be expediting the cooking process? Now, if it's completely cooked, then it would seemingly be okay. Certainly, if we've got all the conditions of chazara. If we're doing it lekatchila, then maybe. But yeah. So long as it's fully cooked, that would seem to be all right. I think there was a discussion about it somewhere here.
Yeah.
If you go back to page 182, you'll see here. This is from the 39 Menachot, the Gray book. So he does discuss this, and he says like this. He talks about a blech. Yeah, he says essentially we have three areas over the blech. So directly over the flame, not over the flame, but yad soledet, meaning it will still get hot. And number three, not over the flame warm, but not yad soledet. So 1 and 2 are essentially the same. I have the area over the blech, which is hot, where the food is going to get cooked, and I have the area that's less hot. So he says, look in the last paragraph, he says the area of the blech number 3 is not similar in any respect to the first two areas. Any part of the blech that is not yad soledet is not considered ala esh, and it's actually no different from any table or kitchen counter. Therefore, one may move a pot of food from the cooler part of the blech. One may not move a pot of food from this cooler part of the blech to any of the first two areas, because this would be chazara. On the other hand, when I place any liquid or food upon the section of the blech, because bishul cannot occur here since it never exceeds yad soledet. So again, so essentially the answer is, again, number one, if the food is fully cooked. Number two, do I have the conditions of chazara? Then I can do it. If I don't have the conditions of chazara, I cannot do it. Unless we're dealing with a situation where we would allow netina lekatchila, which is what we're talking about now. And if I've got those conditions, that would work. So let's see. So, but where we are right now, so we have this.
You wouldn't have conditions of chazara in a case like that?
What?
You wouldn't have conditions of chazara in a case like this, just to move it to another part of the block? What he says here, that you can't, because it would be.
No, so again, so what are the conditions? What are the conditions of chazara? The conditions of chazara are I haven't put it down. I have intent to keep it on fire. It's still warm. So essentially, based on that, if I have food that's fully cooked, now it's on a less part of the blech. I haven't taken it off.
Right.
I don't have the intent to take it off. All I want to do now is move it to the place where it's going to be able to slide it over. So yeah, so according to that would be okay.
Okay, there's a not to. That's what I was wondering, right? What might not?
What I think that's what is, because it's higher, it says here the temperature is higher.
Right.
Wait,
I can't.
any part of the blech that is not yesterday. One may not move a part of food from the cooler part of the blech to any of the first two areas, because this would be chazara. But we're saying that essentially we have the conditions of chazara.
That's what I thought I understood.
Okay, let's see that. Let me check that. Remind me next week. I don't take too much time for the share right now, but remind me next week. I'll get back to you on that point, because it does seem to be a little bit. Meaning, I think I have to look up the Sefer inside. I think he's saying if I don't have the conditions of chazara. But you see, there's three dots here. There's always what's there in the three dots. Okay, maybe I'll look that up in the Sefer Bezrat Hashem. We'll get back to you on that specific question next week. Okay, but now, so again, just to what are we saying? We're saying we have the case of where we want to put our food on top of, not directly on the fire, but on top of a pot that's on top of the fire. We saw one place in the shul that said you can do that if it's chazara, and one place that said you could do that as if it's a netina lekatchila. So one distinction between the two, according to the Pri Megadim, is the pot that I'm putting it on top of, is that an empty pot or is that a pot of cooked food? If it's a pot of cooked food, so that everyone will agree, I can go and can put my schnitzel or my pastry, whatever, on top of that. If it's on top of an empty pot, so not so clear. An empty pot just makes it like a covered flame. So if we just stick with that, we may have a problem at this point. Okay, because based on that distinction of the Pri Megadim, what he's saying is if I have a blech and I now put an empty pot on top of the blech, I can put food back there that was already there on the blech, but I cannot take cold food out of the fridge and put it there in the first place. So we have a problem. That is according to the Pri Megadim. The Magen Avraham understands differently. Source number 36, the Magen Avraham gives a different answer to distinguish here. He says, okay, he says now, יש לומר, דווקא צלי מותר לתנוע לכתחילה על גבי קירה גרופה, אבל מבושל אסור לתנוע על גבי קירה, אפילו חם, שאין בו משום בישול, תגזרינן שמייתן עליו כשהוא קר. Okay, so it's a little bit confusing here because he uses the word tzli and mevushal. Essentially what he's saying is he's distinguishing between hot foods and liquid foods. Dry foods and liquid foods, excuse me. He says that with dry foods, you could place the food on top, but if it's liquid food, then we say no, because we're worried. Remember, if it's liquid food, if it's cold, then you won't be able to place it there because it will be cooking. But essentially, what comes out of this Magen Avraham is that there's no intrinsic difference between if it's an empty pot or it's a pot with food on. The only difference is in terms of the food that I'm placing. But if it's for sure fully cooked food, then I can go in the first place. I can place it on top of the empty pot, and that would be okay. So now we get to our hot plates and our blechs, etc. And we have to see how this works. So the Chazon Ish, that's the first source we have over here. The Chazon Ish is the stringent view. It won't surprise you to hear, but he follows the opinion of the Pri Megadim. Okay, again, whether I can put food on in the first place or not is going to be dependent, maybe, on which of these approaches I accept, of the Pri Megadim or of the Magen Avraham. The Pri Megadim is going to be much more stringent, versus the Magen Avraham will be a little bit more lenient. So see source 37, the Chazon Ish. We're now in purple because we're now into the contemporary poskim. He says, right? First we saw that he said you can only put on top of the empty pot if you're putting the food back or the food was still on the fire. לחם ומונה בשר צונן על הקדרה של הקירה החמור. וכתב בשם פרי מגדים דגדרה הקנית משמשת לקירה. As we said, all that the empty pot does, according to the Pri Megadim, is it just covers the fire. וחשיב כמעמיד על הקירה, okay, and it's as if you're placing it directly on the flame, on the covered flame. אבל מעמיד על הקדרה שתבשיל בתוכה, חשיב כמעמיד על הקדרה ולא כמעמיד על גבי קירה. Okay, so you are placing it on the stove with the food inside. If you place, right, consider placing on the pot and not on the stove, etc. In other words, if you have a pot on top that's got cooked food, then I could place it on top. But if I have an empty pot, I can't. Essentially, the Chazon Ish just says what we saw in the Pri Megadim, and the Orchot Shabbat as well rules stringently on that basis. However, many other poskim, and again, this is probably, I think, this is the Minhag HaOlam nowadays, see this more leniently when we are dealing with, certainly when we're dealing with a hot plate. Okay, I'll just say at this point, up to now, as you can see that when it comes to a blech, okay, it's very, very complicated. With the blech, it's very, very complicated. If I leave my food on the blech before Shabbat, okay, we've discussed that sheyah, that's okay. In other words, if I want to have hot Shabbos lunch, and I only have a blech, I don't have a hot plate, how do I do it? So either if I have the food on from before, I have the chocolate cooking on all night, so there's no problem. If I want to put the food on in the first instance in the morning, so if I follow to put it directly on the blech, it's going to be forbidden. If I have an inverted pan or pot or whatever, and I'm going to place it on top of an empty pot, according to the Pri Megadim and the Chazon Ish, it's still going to be forbidden. So maybe that's why, I don't know if he's here, but the person who told me a couple of weeks ago, what we do, you just need to have your potato salad and cold cuts in the morning, and that's
Right.
okay. Maybe that's where the minhag comes from, to have potato salad and cold cuts,
Well,
because
we
when you're
said
dealing with the
that.
blech, it's very, very complicated. Not so simple. Thankfully, okay, we also have Shabbos hot plates. Okay, and yeah, things do get a little bit more simple. Have a look at the Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata, source number 39. Right, the joke is that a Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata, we'll get to learning Muktzah. I'm sure I've told you this joke before, but the joke is that the Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata is considered a Kli Shemelachto Le'isur, right? Because everything he says is Asur. But here we have actually, first of all, in the footnote, many times the Shmirat Shabbat himself, Rav Noivert, is stringent, and then he brings in the footnotes. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said this, and he said it's mutar, and he said etc. They did. I don't know. I don't know if they've translated the new version, but once they did a translation into English of the Shema Shabbat Kilchata, they translated the text at the top, but they didn't translate any of the footnotes. So you've really only translated half the Sefer. That's certainly a Kli Shemelachto Le'isur, right? But in any event, yeah, even without the footnotes, right, we're going to see that the Shema Shabbat Kilchata is a bit more lenient on this in terms of the hot plates, and let's see why. So he says, "Ulam plata chashmalita miyuchedet l'Shabbat." A hot plate, a Shabbat plata, right, which is there to warm up the food. We don't normally cook on these things. And it doesn't have an adjustment of the temperature setting. Sometimes people get annoyed that the hot plates are too hot, right, and the food burns. But you should know it's very halachically advantageous that you cannot adjust the heat. Okay. Okay, again, here he's talking about shehiyah. We saw the source when we discussed shehiyah. But he says it doesn't need an extra covering. And remember, we said for shehiyah as well, we want the flame to be covered. We want it to be garufa katum. So he says the hot plate itself, this is not a stove. This is considered already a covered flame. So already one step up. And therefore he says, you can return. Again, not yet but you can return, you can put back the pot on it. Okay, that's you need all the other conditions for chazara, as we discussed last week. Okay, same thing. You could put the pot back onto a radiator, which you don't normally cook on, etc. Okay, nonetheless, you should not, even with a hot plate, don't put the food on Shabbat morning, don't put it directly on the hot plate in order to heat it up. Okay, that's what we've been saying. Now, in the Hara, in the comment, he says, Shamati Magon Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal, Nimuko Imo, Tibazeh Shemamid Me'erev Shabbat Hakdera, Plata Kazot, Harei Ze Chashiv Kiktuma. In other words, the point is that the hot plate in and of itself is already considered ketuma. It's already considered a covered flame. Okay, and also there is no reasoning here of that you might stoke the coals. It's not made for cooking. And there's no way that you could change the temperature setting. Okay, now, so here's the point. We're going to see the next part in the Shmirat Shabbat, but based on the Chazon Ish, the Pri Megadim, etc., what we've said is the following, and I'm sure you can already work out the next step. We saw in the Shulchan Aruch that if I put the empty pot on top of the stove, that changes the status of the kirah from an uncovered flame to a covered flame. Okay, it's not enough to turn it into something that doesn't look like cooking, and that's why he said you can keep the pot, you can put the pot back that was already hot, you can return it to the flame there, but you can't put one there l'katchila. All right, but I've changed the status. I've gone from an uncovered flame to a covered flame by putting the empty pot. But what if my starting point is already that it's a covered flame, right? And that's what we're saying here. With the hot plate, milkatchila, it's already considered covered. So now, if I put a pot on top of it, am I now changing it to a situation whereby I'm going to be allowed to place food milkatchila? And that's what the Shema Shabbat Kilchata says yes. It's source 40. Who adin? לפי זה מותר גם לכתחילה להניח בשבת צלחת הפוכה. You take a pot, you take an aluminium tray, whatever it is, you place it inverted on top of the hot plate. וכדומה אגב קירה. כשאינו קדרה מלאה תאפשר גבי האש. I don't have a pot that's full of cooked food on the fire, but I'm putting this empty one. Okay, ולהניח קדרה עליה באופן שאין בו משום איסור בישול. מכיוון שאין דרך בישול בכך. Okay, that is not the way of cooking. It doesn't look like cooking. That would be allowed. ושמעתי מפי חכם אחד, I heard from a certain תלמיד חכם, דווקא אם העמיד את הקדרה על העיקר לגבי אש גלוי, כדי לתת לה דין גופה וכתומה, אבל אם האש כבר הייתה מכוסה, והוא מעמיד את הקדרה כדי לשנות מדרך הבישול. This is our case, right? If I have the fire is already considered covered, which is the hot plate, והוא מעמיד את הקדרה, put the pot on top of it now, כדי לשנות מדרך הבישול, because this is not just changing the status of the fire, but this is deviating from the normal way of cooking. עדיף תווה, ושרי לכולם, אף שהקדרה לא ריקה. In this case, even though the pot is empty, it's going to be allowed. ואם כן, הוא הדין נמי לגבי צלחת הפוכה, על גבי גופה וכתומה, עד כאן דעתו.
What size of the inverted pot? Can it be a centimeter high? Would it have to be 20 centimeters or?
Look, I think essentially what are we saying? We're saying that you're putting it on, it's changing it from that it doesn't look like cooking and it's not the normal way of cooking. If it's something which is impossible to see and you don't even know that it's there, so then no. But again, if you have many people say you have an oven tray, whatever it is, and you put it upside down, and you can see, you look at the platter, you've got this, it's not directly on, and you know when you're putting the food on and when you're taking the food off that it's not directly on the platter. That's enough. That is enough. Okay.
Aluminum foil or wooden.
Yes, some people do that, right? I've seen that. Yeah.
Based on this, just an aluminium foil, I don't think would make a difference. That would not make a difference, yeah. But that may be based on something. That may be based on something else. Again, so just to summarize, again, with the blech, it's more complicated because it still might be a normal way of cooking, and over there, as we've seen, there is the Chazon Ish is stringent, and there are stringent opinions. But again, the Minhag HaOlam is like the Shmas Shabbat Kilchata, which says as follows: when I am dealing with a hot plate, an electric hot plate, since that is already Gufa Uktuma, that's already considered a covered flame, and on the hot plate itself, if I have soup now on Friday night that's on the hot plate, and I take it off because I want to serve, and it's still hot, and I had the intent to put it back, and I didn't put it down on the counter, or according to some opinions, as we've seen, even if I put it down, I could put it back directly on the hot plate because the hot plate is covered. Okay, that's what we discussed. That was last week's share. Again, if this does not sound familiar, I refer you back to YouTube. Okay, but we're now not talking about putting back. We're talking about placing lechatchila, placing in the first instance. And what I'm saying is to place it in the first instance on top of on the platter itself. That I cannot do because it's not chazara. I'm now putting it in the first instance. However,
Even if it's fully cooked.
even if it's fully cooked, yeah, I'm only talking about if it's fully cooked.
Yeah.
Okay, but if I have an inverted pot, even if it's empty, if I have a pot of cooked food that's on the platter to put it on top of that, no question. According to everybody, that's allowed. If I have an empty pot, that's what we're talking about now. According to the Chazon Ish, that may still be problematic. But according to the Shema Shabbat Kilchata, since number one, my starting point is that the platter is a covered flame, and now I have the pot on top, that's completely uprooting it. That's like putting it on the radiator. It's like putting it somewhere else. It doesn't look like cooking, and that is fine. Now, Rav Ovadia Yosef is even more makel on this. He's even more lenient. Okay, and this is not a question of Ashkenazim. To be clear, this is not a question of Ashkenazim and Sfardim. Right? When we say we have a machloket Ashkenazim and Sfardim, that's when I have a machloket between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. For example, coming up to Chanukah, maybe we'll talk about it next week. There's a big machloket about Chanukah. Who likes the Chanukah candle? Do you need, based on the fact that the Gemara says the mitzvah is Nerish Beito, then I have Mahadrin, and then I have Mahadrin and a Mahadrin. I've told you many times, when it comes to Kashrut, Mahadrin is a made-up term. It means something, but where the source of Mahadrin and a Mahadrin is about Chanukah. Okay, but the question is, based on the Sukkah and the Gemara, when we say Mahadrin min a Mahadrin, is that adding on to the level of Mahadrin, or is that adding on to the basic level? And I skip the level of Mahadrin. The nafka mina is, does everybody in the household have to light? Do all the kids have to light their own Chanukah? Or is it enough that you have one Chanukah for the entire household? Okay, that is the machloket between Ashkenazim and Sfardim. It's a machloket between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. It's very interesting. It's one of the cases where the Shulchan Aruch actually paskins like the Ashkenazi Rishonim and the Ramah paskins like the Sfardi Rishonim. It's unusual. Yeah, we find it by Pesach, we find it by a few places. In any event, that's a machloket. It's a classic machloket Ashkenazim Sfardim. When I have a discussion amongst contemporary poskim, Okay, and one says this way and one says that way. Rav Eliashiv says like this, Chazon Ish says like that, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says like this, Rav Ovadia says like that. Happens to be that Rav Shlomo Zalman is a posek Ashkenazi and Rav Ovadia is a posek Sfardi, but this is not a machloket Ashkenazi and Sfardi. If it's based on the understanding of the Shulchan Aruch versus the Ramah, then it's a machloket Ashkenazi and Sfardi. Yeah, that's not the case. So yeah, everybody should follow their posek, whatever it is, whatever they do. But we'll see, and we'll see there are certain Ashkenazi poskim who are going to hold like Rav Ovadia, and certain Sfardi poskim who hold against him. Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, for example, was a lot more machmir. But what Rav Ovadia essentially says is the following. He says that with a hot plate, okay, we have even more room to be lenient. Why? Because nobody cooks on the hot plate in the first place. It's not just like a kira that's covered. This is something completely different.
Right.
What do you use a hot plate for? You use it to warm up food. So you're telling me michzik in bashel, it looks like cooking when I put food on the hot plate. Nobody cooks on the hot plate, so it doesn't look like cooking. So Rav Ovadia has here a tremendous kula, which is that I can take my schnitzels out from the fridge on Shabbos morning that weren't on the hot plate at all, the oil of Shabbos, and I can put them directly on the hot plate. Okay? Eli, you want me to say something controversial all the time? So here we go. Okay, that is Rav. Now I'll say not everybody agrees, but that is Rav Ovadia, and it's important. It's always important to know the Yeshitot, because even if we are in Paskin like this, and even if you follow the more stringent view, remember Maaseh Shabbat, right? So very often you get a call, Rabbi, I was at somebody's house over Shabbos, and I saw they did this in the kitchen. Yeah, can I go back? Can I eat in their house? Is it still kosher? Can I trust them? Can I whatever? Worry, they're following Rabbi Ovadia, everything's fine, right? But the point is, you're at a Shabbos meal and you see somebody heated up the food in a way that's an opinion that we don't follow. That's not the way they should be heating up the food. So is it a problem now? Is it Maaseh Shabbat, which we'll talk about in a later share? But do I have to worry? Am I allowed to benefit? Am I allowed to eat it? So we've said many times, the Pri Megadim in Shin Yud Chet says that any time that somebody performs an action which there is a mainstream opinion that says that is mutar, this can be an opinion in the Rishonim, it can be an opinion in the Achronim. Even if we paskin differently, certainly, b'di'eved, we can rely on that to benefit from it. So we mentioned this last time. We saw the Ran says, when it comes to Chazara, the Ran says the whole discussion about putting food back on the hot plate, that's food that was taken off before Shabbat. The Ran understands that if my food was on the fire when Shabbat came in, and I take it off, I don't need any conditions. I can put it back on. Now, we generally don't try not to paskin like that. But if I was at somebody's house and they did it, they took the soup off and they put it on the floor and they served everybody up and then they put it back on because it was still hot. Okay. So, and they say, do you want seconds? I can say 1 second. I can go and I can benefit from that. Okay. So same thing over here. If you see somebody goes and takes their food and their schnitzels and puts it directly on the hot plate, even though, because we paskin like Rav Shlomo Zalman and like Rav Eliashiv, and they paskin like Rav Ovadia. Okay, beseder. You can still eat the schnitzels. That's the point. That's all that was to tell you, that you can still eat the schnitzel.
Is a warming tray similar to a hot plate?
We'll get to warming tray. So let's just see Rav Ovadia. Yechavedat. Okay. Source number 42. So he says Sheila. Tafshil tzonen shaya monach b'makaram erev Shabbat. האם מותר לחממו על הפלטה של שבת, או יש בזה איסור משום שאינו מבשל בשבת? That's the question. I have a cold dish that was in the fridge on Erev Shabbat. I now want to heat it on the hot plate in the morning. Is that allowed? So he quotes the Magen Avraham, and he quotes Rav Pesach Frank, and he quotes Yaskil Avdi. Bottom line, it says, you can see on page 192, he says, Besikum, Tafshil tzonen shenipashel kol tzoko me'erev Shabbat, a cold dish that was fully cooked on Erev Shabbat, ve'yamonach b'mkareh, and was in the fridge, mutar lechamon b'Shabbat al plata chashmalit shel Shabbat, afilu chom shayad soled bo. You can put it on the hot plate directly on, even if it's going to reach the point of yad soled bo. Okay. Rav Willig of Yad Sos number 43, he says similarly, right, that it's not right. You can see up top of page 193. He says, "Lefise b'medina teinu." Okay, it's not our Medina, but it is Medina, right? Shekim domeh ein aderech levashal plata klal uklal, where it's not that one does not cook on the hot plate at all. Therefore, lo nileh kim vashel, doesn't look like cooking because no one cooks like that. לכן מותר להניח עליה מאכל יבש קל שהוציא מן המקרר וכן נראה לדינה. Okay, he quotes here also Rav Dov Lior says the same thing. Rav Moshe Feinstein, there is a discussion as to precisely what Rav Moshe's opinion was. Some think that he was maker on this, some say that he was a bit more machmir. Okay, so you can see that the bottom of page 194 is the summary of what we've seen. Okay, we saw there was the Chazon Ish and the Orchot Shabbat that was the most stringent. They said one may only place cold food on top of a pot of food, not on top of an empty pot or pan. Okay, and again, based on the Chazon Ish's logic, it doesn't. I'm not sure if he addressed the hot plate directly, but that would certainly be the case on the blech, right? And that's, as we said, why one of the reasons why the blech is so complicated. Number two, the Shema Shabbat Kilchotam Meni Ala Poskim. Again, this is Minhag HaOlam. You want to know the bottom line, what's accepted by just about everybody. Just about everybody. That is number two. When I place cold food on top of an upside down pot or pan on the hot plate. Okay? And that may be the same. That may be the same with the blech as well, but certainly on the hot plate that would be okay. There would be no problem. And then we saw Rav Ovadia and Rav Ulik were even more lenient with the hot plate. Again, this logic would not apply to the blech, but they say that one could even place the food directly on. Again, all of this is relating to netina lekatchila. When I'm talking about chazara, the food that was already there was already on the hot plate. Those were the conditions we discussed last week. Those were conditions in order to place the food back directly on the hot plate. As you can see, according to Rav Ovadia, there's no question because you could place there in the first place. But if we're dealing with a situation of chazara and I'm missing one or more of the conditions, so long as the food is still hot, so then I can put it back on top of an upside down pot on top of the hot plate. Right? That would be fine. Now somebody asked about warming drawers. That's an excellent question because it appears on the next page, 196. Okay. Now with warming drawers, there are two issues. One is the issue of the thermostat. Again, similarly to when we discussed the ovens. We're not going to talk about that now. But if you know, based on how the thermostat works, and opening the drawer or closing it, if it's going to cause changes, it's going to affect the thermostat. So that's a separate problem. But in terms of the question of chazara or placing the food there, so he says like this. So we have. Essentially, there are two opinions. Number 46 of Avram Mishal of the Star K. He writes here: if a warming drawer is not controlled by a thermostat, one must check with the manufacturer to be sure that opening the drawer will not turn off the heating element. Okay, as previously discussed regarding stovetop controls, if there are multiple temperature settings, these controls must be covered. Even when the warming drawer is not controlled by a thermostat and opening the drawer will not affect the flow of power to bring to the heating element, one cannot place the food into the warming drawer on Shabbos if its operating temperature is higher than Yad Soledet. Well, this is prohibited under the laws of Chazara. So that is the stringent view that says, if it's only, and again, it's based on the idea, if it's something which is going to reach a very, very high temperature and it's going to cook, so then there is an union of Michzikim Vashel. But if it's only a low temperature and it's just there for warming, that's similar to the hot plate, then we would say that is allowed.
What exactly is a warming tray? Is it like a black?
No.
No,
What is
drawer.
it? Under a stove.
It's a drawer.
It's a drawer.
It's like a little cupboard that you put the food in and it keeps it hot.
Yeah, so what is it? What am I putting it on?
I'm putting the food in the warming tray. What do you mean? It's an appliance. It exists by itself.
So I'm opening a drawer and there's, what is in there? What is it? It's a flat top?
Yeah. The drawer itself, there is some sort of a thermostat inside. There's a heating element inside the drawer that keeps the food warm.
Okay, so then it just keeps it warm, but it can't make it come to cook.
Well, there. So it depends what kind. Nowadays, you have all sorts of appliances and all sorts of drawers and all sorts of settings. So he's saying like this: if it is such that it can't cook, that it's a warming drawer by definition, like the Plata Shel Shabbat, that it cannot reach the heat of cooking, so then you can put it inside. Okay, there's an opinion here that even if it's hotter than that, you can still put it inside as well. But that's again, providing the one cover. If it has settings, etc., you have to cover the knobs and the rest of it. Yeah.
I was told that you're not allowed to put something into something, that's why, an avolacha, so.
That's fine.
I forgot the name, but
That's
even
fine.
the cholent pot, you have to put something under, if you're gonna put the whole thing in.
Okay, so that's
So
right.
that to me is a warming drawer, but everybody uses warming. drawer.
Okay, so very briefly, that's right to hatmana, which is insulation, which is our next topic. Okay, we've done shehiyah. We said there are 3 rabbinic prohibitions, 3 gzerot when it comes to heating food on Shabbat. All the Torah said is that you can't cook. That's all it said. Right? You can't cook if the food is cooked. So Rabbanan said there are 3 more things that I'm concerned. You might come to stoke the coals. You might come to raise the heat. You might look like cooking. Number 1, we spoke about shehiyah, which is leaving the food on the fire before Shabbat. Number 2 was chazara, putting the food on the fire on Shabbat, which is what we're dealing with now. And the third case is hatmana, which is insulating the food before Shabbat, right? And that will be the next topic. I'll just say that 2 things. One is there's going to be a discussion, we'll see, what's called hatmana b'miktzat, which means if I cover up the food, but not entirely, so take the cholent pot, for example, the bottom is covered, but the top is not covered. Right? I mean, it's covered with the lid, but it's not covered by the heating element. So that's a discussion of hatmana b'miktzat. Number two is when Chazal spoke about insulating food, they were generally talking about the food or the pot. The pot itself was covered, was wrapped up in whatever material. It's good. But if you take the pot and you put it inside a box, or what we call an oven or a drawer or something like that, so you're not, and there's space, there's air in between, so that's not necessarily the same as covering it up. But again, we'll get to that. That's the next topic. That's hatmana. Okay, one more thing is, should we talk about it now or should we leave it for the next time? Okay, we'll leave it for the next time. That is so we can discuss fully. That is the question of what we already saw: adding hot water to prevent a fully cooked food. Right? You wake up in the morning, you see the cholent is getting is starting to burn. Right? You want to know, can you add water? So I'll just say, to add cold water, you definitely can't. Okay, because then you're cooking the water. Question is, can I take cooked water? Can I take boiling water from Kli Rishon, from Kli Sheni? We discussed before. Can I add that on to the food? Right? That we'll look at next week. Okay. No, we won't look at that next week because next week maybe we will. Next week we'll look at Hanukkah. Maybe we'll do that Hashlamah as well. Yeah. So next week's Hanukkah, and afterwards we probably won't have a show the week after, but we will. I'll let you know. Okay. Have a good day, everybody. Have a good week. Thank you for coming. Bye-bye.
And Natalie?